The rain erased the road. The crash erased a life, and a widow emerged from the wreckage carrying nothing but sympathy and secrets. Was it fate that spared her, or planning? Because 6 months later, when money vanished and a lover surfaced overseas, investigators realized this wasn't an accident at all. It was an escape, and every escape leaves a trail. Rain fell in sheets that night, hammering the highway until the road looked like a black river. Headlights smeared into pale ghosts, and the sound of twisting metal cut through the storm with a violence that felt unreal. By the time the first patrol car arrived, the damage had already settled into stillness. A luxury sedan lay crushed against the guardrail, its front end folded inward like paper forced into a fist dot inside the wreck. The factory owner was already gone. His body was pinned by the steering column, his face turned toward the shattered windshield, eyes open but empty. Blood mixed with rainwater and ran in thin streams across the asphalt. Paramedics moved with practiced urgency, but there was nothing to save. They checked anyway. They always did. A few yards away, they found his wife. She was half conscious, tangled in a web of airbags and broken glass, her white coat soaked red at the shoulder. She kept trying to speak, but no sound came out at first, only breath, sharp and uneven. When they pulled her free, she flinched at every touch, as if the night itself were hurting her. Someone wrapped a blanket around her. Another voice asked her name. Another told her to stay awake. She nodded, unfocused, rain streaking down her face like tears she hadn't chosen. Blue and red lights flooded the scene, reflecting off wet pavement and twisted steel. Traffic slowed, drivers craning their necks to see what disaster looked like up close. Phones were raised. Photos were taken before the bodies were covered. Within minutes, whispers spread. The factory owner was dead, his young wife alive. A tragedy. A miracle, a story already forming. At the hospital, the storm followed them in. Nurses cut away her clothes, cleaned the blood, cataloged her injuries. Minor fractures, a concussion, shock. She answered questions softly, mechanically, her voice barely louder than the machines beeping beside her bed. Yes, she had been in the passenger seat. Yes, it happened so fast. Yes, the rain was heavy. She closed her eyes when they told her he hadn't made it. By morning, the news vans arrived. A black and white photo of the couple appeared on screens across town. Him older, heavy-set, serious. Her younger, pale, smiling beside him. Reporters spoke in solemn tones about a respected businessman lost too soon, about a wife spared by chance. Neighbors brought flowers to the gates of the estate. Employees stood in small clusters outside the factory, stunned, quiet. Sympathy poured in, warm and unquestioning. In her private room, the widow lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles. The painkillers dulled her body but left her mind sharp, restless. Every sound felt amplified, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant echo of carts rolling down the hallway, the soft murmur of voices just outside her door. She did not cry. Her eyes stayed dry, fixed, as if tears belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. A detective stopped by briefly, gentle and deferential. "Routine questions," he said. "Accidents like this happened all the time, especially in weather like that. Speed and rain were a dangerous mix. Brake failure was mentioned almost casually as an unfortunate possibility." She nodded, compliant, her hands folded neatly over the thin hospital blanket. When he left, the room felt larger, emptier. She turned her head slightly and looked at the window, where rain still traced slow paths down the glass. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, her husband's body lay cold, tagged, documented. The world believed it understood what had happened on that road. She closed her eyes then, not in grief, but in something closer to release, and for the first time since the crash, allowed herself a single silent thought. The accident had worked. But survival, she knew, demanded silence now, before questions ever learned how to speak. Black fabric became her uniform. Every morning she stepped out of the mansion dressed in mourning, long sleeves, muted heels, her hair pulled back just enough to look undone but dignified. The town responded exactly as expected. People lowered their voices when she entered a room. Hands reached for hers without asking. Condolences were offered in soft repetitions, and she accepted each one with the same measured nod, the same distant expression, as if grief had hollowed her out and left only politeness behind. She learned quickly what they needed from her. At the funeral, she stood perfectly still beside the casket, her face pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When she spoke, it was only to thank them for coming, for caring, for remembering the man they admired. Cameras captured her profile, the slight tremble in her hands. Headlines followed, "Devoted wife left behind." No one questioned the performance. It was flawless because it was simple. Silence did most of the work. Inside the mansion, the air felt staged, like a set preserved after filming ended. His presence lingered in expensive furniture, framed awards, the faint smell of cologne that refused to fade from the master bedroom. She moved through the rooms carefully, as if touching the wrong object might wake him. Yet each night when she closed the door behind her, relief settled into her chest. Slow and undeniable paperwork replaced mourning. Lawyers spoke gently, explaining assets, accounts, properties. She listened intently, asking precise questions. Control crept in where chaos had once lived. The house, once governed by his routines and moods, now bent to her decisions. She changed nothing outwardly, but inside, something shifted into alignment. Neighbors continued to visit. Former employees dropped off casseroles. She thanked them all, her voice steady, her eyes appropriately distant. Alone afterward, she stood at the window and watched their cars disappear, feeling nothing resembling loss. What surprised her most was not the absence of sorrow, but how quickly she adjusted to its absence. At night, she slept deeply for the first time in years. Occasionally, a memory surfaced without warning. A raised voice, a hand gripping too tightly, the quiet humiliation of being corrected in public. These moments came and went like brief static, never strong enough to disrupt the calm she had constructed. She reminded herself that the past no longer had authority. Here one afternoon, while sorting through unopened mail, her phone vibrated softly in her palm. An unfamiliar number. She hesitated only a second before answering. "Are you alone?" a male voice asked, low and careful. She glanced instinctively toward the hallway, then the door. "Yes," she replied, barely above a whisper. There was a pause, filled with something unspoken. "Relief maybe, or hunger. I saw the news," he said. "You did everything right." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "Not now," she murmured, though she didn't hang up. "Just wanted to hear your voice," he continued. "To know you're okay." She closed her eyes. "I'm more than okay," she said, and ended the call before either of them said more than they should. Later, she stood in the bedroom, staring at her reflection. The perfect widow stared back, composed, untouchable, convincing. Beneath the black fabric and practiced sorrow, something new stirred quietly, patiently. Her life hadn't ended on the highway. It had cleared space. And somewhere beyond the town's sympathy and the mansion's heavy silence, another future waited, already moving toward her. The factory had always been loud, but the noise hid quieter hierarchies. Machines roared, conveyors rattled, metal struck metal, yet power moved silently through offices above the floor. From his glass-walled office, the owner watched everything, controlled everything. Workers learned early when to speak and when to keep their heads down. Paychecks came with obedience. Ambition stayed carefully muted. She had visited the factory many times before the crash, always as an extension of him. Introduced as his wife, escorted through aisles thick with oil and heat, she smiled when expected and stayed silent when conversations turned technical. Most workers barely noticed her. Others noticed too much. She felt their eyes linger, curious, appraising, sometimes resentful. She belonged to the man who owned the building. That was all that mattered except to one of them. He was young, barely past 20, assigned to maintenance and logistics. Jobs that kept him moving between spaces, half visible, easily overlooked. He learned the factory the way some people learned cities: exits, blind spots, routines. He noticed how she paused near the production line, how her gaze drifted away from her husband during meetings. He noticed the tension in her shoulders when the owner spoke sharply to a supervisor. None of it felt accidental. Their first interaction was insignificant on the surface. A clipboard dropped, papers scattered. He knelt to help her gather them, their fingers brushing briefly over the same page. She flinched, then looked at him. Not sharply, not warmly, just fully. Something passed between them, quick and electric, before she straightened and thanked him with a polite smile meant for distance, but distance eroded. He began finding reasons to be nearby when she visited, offering directions she didn't need, holding doors open too long, watching her reactions more than her movements. She noticed his attention, felt it settle on her like a question she wasn't supposed to answer. At home, her husband's voice filled rooms with certainty and correction. At the factory, the young workers' silence felt like permission. Their conversations stayed harmless at first. Small complaints disguised as jokes. Shared observations about the factory's grind. He spoke about long hours, about how promotions stalled unless you were born into the right position. She listened, recognizing the bitterness. When she spoke, it was careful, indirect, mentions of loneliness, of being invisible despite standing beside power. He never interrupted. Resentment became their shared language. The line was crossed quietly. A hand brushing her back to guide her through a crowded aisle. A pause too long near the stairwell. The first time they were alone together, it lasted less than a minute, but it rewired something essential. There was no declaration, no promise. Only the understanding that they saw something in each other that the rest of the world ignored. They met in fragments, behind storage rooms, in parked cars, once in an empty office after hours. Desire was present but not dominant. What bound them was recognition. He wanted out of a life that would never offer more than survival. She wanted out of a marriage that treated her as decoration. Each became proof that the other's hunger was justified. He began asking questions. About schedules, about Ruth's home, about her husband's habits. She answered more than she should have, framing it as venting, as harmless release. When she complained about control, about being trapped, he didn't offer comfort. He offered imagination. There are ways, he said once, voice low, careful. People leave worse situations than yours. She didn't respond immediately. The idea frightened her. It also settled somewhere deep, heavy, and warm. Escape stopped being abstract. It became logistical. By the time the accident happened, the factory no longer felt like a workplace in her memory. It felt like the place where permission was first granted, where resentment sharpened into intention, where two people learned that wanting more could feel like entitlement. In the quiet weeks after the funeral, as she stood alone in the mansion, those factory shadows stretched long across her thoughts. Somewhere inside them, the first outline of the plan waited, patient, unfinished, and already dangerous. Planning did not arrive as a single decision. It crept in through repetition, through conversations that circled the same dissatisfactions until they hardened into options. After the funeral, contact became careful, coded. She deleted messages immediately. He spoke only when necessary. What had once felt electric now felt deliberate, stripped of romance and dressed in practicality. They started with roots. He drove them late at night, memorizing curves and guardrails, noting where the road narrowed and the lights thinned. She watched from the passenger seat, pretending indifference while storing every detail. Rain became a variable, not a threat. Storm forecasts were checked with the same seriousness as bank balances. When the weather cooperated, their confidence grew. The car came next. Maintenance schedules were discussed casually at first, complaints framed as irritation with inconvenience. She mentioned the brakes dragging, the faint noise that came and went. He listened, then waited. Delays were introduced quietly, appointments postponed, paperwork misplaced, nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would fail too soon. What unsettled her most was how calm she felt during these talks. Fear appeared only in flashes, late at night, alone, when she imagined metal folding and bodies breaking. Desire answered quickly, reminding her of years spent swallowing words, of hands that guided rather than held. Guilt tried to surface, but it had been muted long ago by emotional suffocation. Planning gave her a sense of control she had never been allowed. They stopped speaking about feelings altogether. Instead, they discussed timing, angles, speed. He explained physics with confidence that bordered on arrogance. She asked precise questions, surprising even herself. Each answer made the outcome feel less like murder and more like engineering. Still, doubt lingered. One evening, she sat across from her husband at dinner, watching him eat methodically, listening to him complain about workers who lacked discipline. He spoke of legacy, of what he had built. For a moment, she saw his age clearly, the fragility beneath authority. The thought of stopping crossed her mind, sharp and fleeting. Then he corrected her over something trivial, and the moment vanished, the final plan formed without ceremony. A familiar route home. A night when rain would soften edges and blur details. She would sit quietly, as she always did. He would drive faster than usual, impatient, distracted. The brakes would fail at the worst possible moment, not completely, just enough. Chance would do the rest. In the days leading up to it, she noticed how the world seemed to cooperate. Storm warnings appeared. His schedule tightened. He refused to let anyone else drive. Each coincidence reinforced the narrative they were building, inevitability. When fear returned, she reframed it as survival instinct, something that proved she was alive. On the night itself, there was no dramatic farewell. No final kiss. Only a brief look exchanged earlier that day, heavy with understanding. She dressed carefully, choosing something neutral, forgettable. In the car, she focused on breathing, on the sound of rain beginning to fall as speed increased. Her perception shifted. The road narrowed. Time stretched. When the brakes resisted and then gave, the sensation was not panic but confirmation. The crash unfolded exactly as imagined, violent yet controlled in its outcome later. Lying in the hospital bed, she would replay those seconds repeatedly, searching for chaos. She would not find it. What haunted her instead was how planned it all had been, how the fall had felt less like an accident and more like the natural conclusion of a long descent. By the time the world called it tragedy, she already understood it as design. In the quiet hours that followed, paperwork and procedures began to loom in her thoughts. She imagined signatures, transfers, the weight of ownership shifting hands. Survival would require patience now, restraint, the performance she had mastered. The plan did not end with impact. It extended into inheritance, into silence, into waiting. As monitors beeped steadily around her, she accepted that the most dangerous part was no longer the road. But what came after, when attention faded and assets changed names? That future demanded stillness, precision, and an unbreakable mask forward. The courtroom was quiet, hushed with a weight that almost felt ritualistic. The judge read aloud, each word measured, deliberate. Accounts, properties, investments all were listed and transferred as if on autopilot. She listened politely, expression controlled, eyes forward, hands folded in her lap. The factory, the cars, the house, they all became hers with a simple signature, a ceremonial nod, a stamp of inevitability. Relief should have settled in. Instead, a subtle tension lingered behind her ribs outside. The press gathered, cameras flashing for angles that would tell the story of a grieving widow who inherited a fortune overnight. Condolences persisted, gifts arrived, employees offered loyalty. It was almost comforting, the world's attention focused elsewhere. No one noticed the small details, the ones that didn't fit the neat narrative. Insurance policies updated unusually fast, statements logged days before the crash, maintenance reports missing just enough to be suspicious if anyone cared to check. She noticed them. She cataloged them silently, curiosity and caution intertwining like twin shadows. Investigators closed the file quietly, filing it under accidental death. No interviews, no follow-ups, nothing that might draw attention. The widow smiled politely at the few officials who made the rounds, exchanged the right phrases, and kept her thoughts carefully contained. She could see the framework of investigation stretching out, fading just as quickly, leaving a space that was both liberating and unnerving. Freedom tasted like anticipation and careful restraint, a temporary reward that demanded vigilance. Inside the mansion, the silence was complete, almost suffocating. Rooms that had once felt oppressive now hummed with potential, the kind that could be molded, arranged, controlled. She moved through them with the precision of someone who had learned to value order over emotion, turning lights on and off, opening doors, closing drawers. Every object, every surface became a measure of her autonomy. Yet in the corners of her mind, shadows lingered, gaps in records, lapses in observation, anomalies that hinted the past might be reaching forward, ready to disturb the present. She spent hours reviewing paperwork, tax documents, the factory ledger, anything that might reveal weakness. The erasures, the odd timestamps, the subtle inconsistencies, they called to her like warnings. She cataloged them carefully, more curious than afraid. There was power in understanding, she realized, in knowing where control had once slipped and where it might yet falter. It was a dangerous fascination, a quiet game played with unseen opponents, but one that felt necessary. Night fell, and with it, an unfamiliar weight. Sleep came only in fragments. Every shadow in the mansion seemed a potential witness, every echo a reminder that surveillance, though paused, was not necessarily gone. Her mind turned over possibilities. Visitors she hadn't noticed, calls not recorded, errands taken too quickly. Each thought sharpened her awareness, intensified the sense that her dominion was temporary, fragile, contingent. The past had not been silenced. It had merely withdrawn, waiting. By the following morning, the world had resumed its rhythm outside her gates. Flowers wilted slightly in the sun, cars resumed their hum on the roads, employees filed past the factory as if nothing had changed. She remained inside, observing, calculating, listening. Freedom felt both real and conditional. Each breath reminded her that survival was no longer about hiding in grief, it was about vigilance. The mansion was hers. The wealth was hers. Yet an unspoken truth loomed over every polished surface. Control was never absolute, and danger waited quietly in the spaces between certainty and accident. In that quiet, she understood something new. Inheritance was not only about possessions, it was about awareness. And awareness required patience, restraint, and constant observation because nothing, especially freedom, lasted forever. The world outside could forgive, overlook, forget. She could not. The cracks in the system whispered to her, and she was listening. 6 months had passed since the accident, and the town's memory of tragedy had dulled into routine. Flowers on the gates wilted and were replaced by fresh bouquets. Employees returned to the factory floor, murmuring quietly about productivity and deadlines. She moved among them only occasionally, her visits brief and calculated, maintaining the illusion of mourning while the machinery of her life began to shift. On the surface, she was the same grieving widow. Beneath it, a network of movement and intention had taken shape. It began with a quiet phone call to the bank. An auditor had flagged several offshore transfers connected to the estate, funds moving in ways that, while legal on paper, were oddly timed and too clean to be coincidental. A pattern emerged, invisible to the untrained eye. Transfers just after payroll, accounts activated then frozen, intermediaries changing names but not amounts. Detectives took notice. What had been filed as an accident became less theoretical. They reopened the files, poring over ledgers and statements with the diligence of hunters sensing prey. She was aware of their scrutiny. Awareness was instinct, not paranoia. Decisions were deliberate, precise. Property that had seemed permanent, an apartment building downtown, a vacation home in the mountains, was quietly listed for sale. Letters were sent, agents notified, transactions scheduled. Her tone with brokers was polite, almost deferential. "I need distance," she said, framing her exit as healing, a search for perspective. Behind the words, a different narrative unfurled. She was preparing to disappear. Travel arrangements were made months in advance, under the guise of leisure and recovery. Flights booked to secondary airports, tickets purchased with cash and preloaded cards. Identity traces minimized. When she left, no one in the town realized the gravity of her departure. Employees watched her car disappear down familiar streets, a widow leaving for vacation. Investigators, meanwhile, began connecting dots. Names, accounts, transactions all pointed outward. The trail extended beyond national borders, toward warmer climates where anonymity was easier and observation less intrusive. Overseas, she arrived in a city bathed in late afternoon sun, a place of wide sidewalks, narrow cafes, and an indifferent rhythm. The mansion and factory were distant, irrelevant. Here, she could inhabit a new identity with the same care she had given the role of widow. Freedom, however, was not simple. It required constant awareness, monitoring of local authorities, attention to travel advisories, and the careful management of communications. Every decision was a calculation, every gesture measured. Meanwhile, detectives began coordinating with international offices. Interpol inquiries were filed discreetly. Statements from the bank were reread, signatures compared, patterns analyzed. Questions began to form. Why now? Why these accounts? Why transfers aligned with payroll and not the accident? Each small irregularity became a thread, each thread a potential unraveling. The investigation, once a paper exercise, had become active, immediate, tangible. Back in her temporary apartment, she unpacked minimally, leaving rooms deliberately sparse. Letters, bills, reminders, none of it remained. Only what was essential. She watched through blinds, careful, alert. Her movements were deliberate, rehearsed, but not fearful. The realization that the authorities were tracking her in some capacity did not provoke panic, it provoked planning. Awareness sharpened. Each day, she assessed risk, reevaluated routes, monitored banking logs. Every decision contained the possibility of exposure, and every choice reinforced the illusion that she had disappeared entirely. That evening, as she sipped coffee and scanned local news feeds, a name caught her eye. The auditor had reported anomalies back home, patterns forming in the estate she left behind. She paused, considering the implications. Eyes turned outward and not just hers. Someone was watching, someone piecing together what had seemed like coincidence. The game had shifted, and with it the rules became clear. Disappearance was no longer passive. It required attention, adaptation, and the readiness for revelation. And revelation was coming. The plane touched down on sun-bleached tarmac, and the air smelled of salt and heat, unfamiliar but intoxicating. They moved through the airport with practiced ease, passports stamped, bags light. Spain was supposed to be a clean slate, a place without questions, without cameras, without the constant echo of investigation. Cafes with wrought-iron tables became their morning ritual. Streets lined with orange trees framed their laughter. For a while, the world outside ceased to exist, replaced by the intoxication of freedom and the thrill of impunity. They rented an apartment on the third floor of a building tucked into a narrow alley. Windows faced the street, offering anonymity disguised as exposure. Inside, the space was deliberately minimal, sparse furniture, muted colors, nothing that could tie them to the past. They moved freely, cooking, shopping, planning outings. In public, they were tourists, lovers, travelers. In private, they were careful, precise, aware. The first weeks passed with an intoxicating blend of excitement and relief. The crash and inheritance felt like a distant life, one they had escaped entirely, yet the perfection of escape was fragile. Routine seeped in, and with routine came observation. She noticed him lingering on his phone, checking messages, tracing routes, calculating. He noticed her eyes watching him, tracking every minor movement, every pause in conversation. Where once glances had sparked heat, they now triggered suspicion. Their freedom, once a shared dream, became a landscape of subtle surveillance. They were no longer partners in escape. They were witnesses to one another, cataloging behaviors, guarding secrets, measuring trust. Arguments were rare but sharp. A misplaced receipt, a delayed reply, a glance at the street below, each became a spark. Words that had been whispered in shared desire were now sharpened into veiled accusations. They laughed in cafes, but the laughter occasionally trembled, fragile and rehearsed, as if both were testing the strength of their own calm. Paranoia infiltrated the edges of routine. Every interaction carried potential consequence, every movement an opportunity for exposure. They spent hours planning further, meticulously, as if escape required continuous adjustment. Routes to neighboring towns, identification of local law enforcement stations, observation of public cameras, mapping the flow of cash. Every day became a calculation, a rehearsal of contingencies. The romance that had fueled the plan felt transactional now, stripped of fantasy. Desire existed, but it was tempered by survival, by the constant presence of possibility. They were no longer merely alive. They were performing life as if every detail could become evidence. Evenings offered a thin veneer of intimacy. Shared meals, whispered jokes, occasional touches, fleeting moments of warmth. Yet beneath the surface, every action was measured, every smile evaluated. The past, distant yet omnipresent, cast a shadow that stretched into the sunlit streets of their new city. Each day reminded them that escape was not an event but a continuum, a constant negotiation between risk and pleasure, observation and trust. One afternoon, as she looked out over the plaza from their balcony, she noticed a man taking photographs across the street, lingering too long, angle too deliberate. Her pulse quickened, fingers tightening around the railing. He, noticing her tension, said nothing, but his eyes reflected the same calculation she felt mirrored in herself. For a fleeting moment, they were no longer lovers or fugitives. They were both suspects, watched and watching, trapped in the performance they had constructed by nightfall. The city had returned to its indifferent rhythm. Lights shimmered on narrow streets, laughter echoed from distant restaurants, oblivious to their careful existence. Inside the apartment, they sat in near silence, aware of one another's presence, each pondering what surveillance, what scrutiny, what revelation might come next. The fantasy of escape had collapsed into reality. Freedom was measured, happiness conditional, and trust had become another form of danger. Each knew the other held the potential to undo them. And in that knowledge, the edges of romance sharpened into tension, quiet, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. The knock at the apartment door came softly, almost hesitant but precise. She opened it to two men in plain clothes, polite, professional. Names were exchanged, papers signed, assurances given that this was routine. Their presence was unassuming, almost deferential, as if they were passing through a space already governed by someone else's rules. She smiled, measured, calm, every movement intentional. Control remained hers, unchallenged, visible in posture and expression. They began interviews quietly, one at a time. The widow answered questions with practiced precision, providing information that was true yet carefully framed. Dates, locations, financial transactions. She supplied facts without embellishment, never volunteering more than necessary. Politeness masked calculation, composure cloaked strategy. Her answers were small, measured, and while the men took notes, they could feel the weight of her observation, as if she were noting them as much as they were noting her. Each question reinforced her position. She was untouchable, untangled, ready. When the younger man was called, the atmosphere shifted. He had anticipated this moment, rehearsed responses, visualized every contingency. But reality always arrives differently than expectation. Questions that seemed simple, timing of travel, meetings, communications, caused pauses he did not intend. He hesitated before answering, stumbled over phrasing, corrected himself too quickly. Sweat beaded at his temples, unnoticed at first, but visible enough to create an impression of nervousness. Small truths slipped in, glances at the widow, references to shared routines, acknowledgments of places he should not have mentioned. Each disclosure was minor individually, but collectively they formed a pattern he could not control. She noticed it immediately. Every pause, every misstatement, every unguarded motion was catalogued silently, expanding the map of knowledge she held over him. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable in a way she never had been. The balance of power shifted imperceptibly, yet undeniably. Confidence fractured into fragments, each one escaping the careful cage he had built around his composure. She remained quiet, letting observation replace words, letting the cracks in his facade speak louder than any interrogation could. Questions intensified. Gently at first, probing routines, finances, flights, and accommodations. Each answer he gave carried weight beyond intention, revealing reliance, complicity, and subtle inconsistencies. Investigators made notes, documented the overlaps and gaps, and left gaps themselves for him to fill in. With each reply, he betrayed small bits of structure, building a silent case without realizing it. The psychological landscape shifted, tilting toward exposure. The quiet tension in the room thickened, pressing down on every movement, every breath. She did not intervene, did not correct, did not react. Her restraint became the counterpoint to his unraveling, emphasizing the contrast between composure and fracture. Words that might have betrayed her were withheld. Words that might have protected him were left unsaid. They were both performing, yet only one maintained control. By the end of the sessions, the investigators had more than they had arrived for. The widow emerged unscathed, almost luminous in composure. The young man walked away, silent, tense, aware that something had escaped him, something vital, delicate, incriminating, but too late to retrieve. The narrative was quietly rewriting itself. The roles had subtly reversed. She observed, he performed outside, they paused together for a moment. He avoided her gaze, aware that the cracks were visible, that his own truth was leaking. She met his eyes only briefly, offering nothing. The equilibrium had shifted, and with it, the certainty that the next phase, revelation, confrontation, exposure, would demand more than careful control. Small truths had surfaced, and once they do, nothing remained entirely hidden. The interrogation room smelled of stale air and anxiety, its fluorescent lights harsh and unflinching. A table separated them from the investigators, pens poised, cameras rolling. Evidence had accumulated over weeks. Deleted messages recovered, GPS pings restored to precise locations, break analysis from the crash reconstructed with scientific rigor. Each piece was small, objective, unemotional, yet collectively they formed a lattice of truth that was inescapable. She entered first, her posture rigid but her expression calm. Questions were precise, deliberate, circling familiar territory. The route home, timing, traffic, her husband's routines. She answered cautiously, supplying facts without embellishment, measured to the second, rehearsed to the millisecond. Her calm gave investigators confidence, yet a quiet tension remained. Her presence alone suggested an awareness that extended beyond the room. She was careful, deliberate, but silent in ways that threatened exposure. He was called next. His arrival was less composed. Nervous energy radiated off him in waves, subtle tremors in fingers, a flicker in his eyes whenever the widow's name appeared in conversation. Investigators began piecing together moments he could not hide. Slight pauses, contradictions, admissions he thought were inconsequential. Each question forced him deeper into his own recollection, each answer tangled him further. His version of the night was plausible in isolation, but cross-referencing it with recovered messages and GPS data created cracks, wide enough to let truth leak. The first confession came quietly. Under direct questioning, he admitted to being with her that night, but emphasized chance and coincidence, framing the crash as impulsive, unplanned. He avoided eye contact, voice wavering at times, careful to couch statements in hypotheticals. His tone suggested honesty, yet every word was a negotiation with the past, a calibration between what he could admit and what he needed hidden. The evidence contradicted him, but he could not see it fully, trapped by his own selective memory. She told a different story entirely, one that emphasized fear, distance, and accidental circumstances. Her phrasing was deliberate, precise, designed to align with documented facts, but framed emotionally to garner sympathy. She portrayed herself as passive, a passenger of circumstance rather than participant in design. Her answers were polished, rehearsed, yet small slips emerged. Phrases that echoed his story, reactions timed too perfectly, minor details that hinted at knowledge only the guilty could possess. Investigators noted the overlaps silently, cataloged them, and set them aside for the final comparison. The room felt smaller as their stories continued to diverge. Each confession, each calculated omission, layered on the other. Investigators cross-examined carefully, revealing discrepancies in times, distances, and observations. Messages recovered from encrypted phones were presented one by one. GPS logs were laid across the table like a map of intentions. Break analyses were explained, charts showing failure patterns and tampering. Every fact pressed against the narrative each had constructed. Neither story could fully withstand scrutiny. Both contained elements of truth and deception that, when aligned, formed a pattern of collusion, design, and forethought. At one point, the lover broke down slightly, stammering over details that had previously seemed trivial. The widow watched silently, expression unchanged. Her calm emphasized the fragility of his composure. Investigators remained patient, letting the contradictions surface naturally, allowing his own version to undermine itself. Every hesitant word widened the fissure between their narratives. By the session's end, the room was heavy with unspoken admission. Neither could fully claim innocence, yet neither had entirely confessed. Their stories overlapped at critical junctures, enough to implicate both, yet diverged in ways that left investigators wary of missing details. The revelation was subtle, insidious. Truth was not uniform, and in attempting to protect themselves, they had woven confessions that destroyed each other. Every sentence they uttered carried weight, every memory reconstructed became evidence, and every pause revealed more than either had intended. When they left the room, silence lingered, thick and unresolved. Investigators exchanged notes, cataloging patterns, preparing for confrontation. Outside, the air felt colder, heavier, as though the world had shifted imperceptibly. The cracks had become visible, and now the delicate structure of collusion threatened to collapse entirely. New revelations were poised to emerge, and the lovers, once bound by secrecy, were now caught in the fragile lattice of mutual exposure. The courthouse loomed like a theater, its marble steps and ornate columns promising gravity and consequence. Inside, the room hummed with expectation. Reporters murmured into microphones, cameras clicked and whirred, and spectators leaned forward as if their gaze could penetrate beyond the legal formalities. The trial had become a public spectacle, a drama that extended far beyond the defendants themselves. Every word spoken would be dissected, broadcast, and debated, while the truth lurked in the spaces between testimony and emotion. She entered first, dressed in dark tones, hair pinned neatly, expression composed. Cameras captured the poised widow, the embodiment of restraint, yet beneath the surface, tension coiled tightly. Her lawyers guided her to the stand, and as the oath was administered, her voice remained steady when questioned about her movements on the night of the crash. Her account was precise, polished, and strategically incomplete, revealing what was necessary to satisfy procedure while concealing the rest. Yet cracks began to form under cross-examination, phrases contradicted by recovered messages, fleeting hesitations noted by the attorneys, and subtle inconsistencies magnified under scrutiny. Public sympathy wavered as fragments of her constructed persona began to falter. The lover took the stand next. His presence was less composed, movements jittery, eyes darting at the judge, attorneys, and occasionally toward her. The pressure was immediate and unrelenting. Early questions were factual, probing routines, locations, and communications. He stumbled at first, then shifted strategies, trading partial truths for survival. Each admission, small, calculated, reluctant, exposed more than he intended. He spoke of shared moments that had previously been framed as incidental, of conversations that revealed premeditation, and of decisions made in tandem. With every confession, the courtroom watched a carefully constructed facade dissolve. Cross-examination intensified. Evidence was laid bare. GPS logs, break reports, recovered messages, and transaction records were projected for the jury, each detail reframing the narrative. The widow's calmness faced relentless contrast against his faltering composure. Words meant to exonerate became damning in context. Silences became as revealing as statements. The interplay between them suggested both manipulation and desperation, blurred lines between loyalty and self-preservation. Attorneys pressed motives, raising the question: was this the act of a calculating widow, or two individuals trapped by circumstance, swept into moral compromise by their own desires? The spectators leaned in as subtle tension escalated. Witnesses recounted small anomalies, meetings that occurred at strange hours, private calls, observed glances at the factory that implied intent. Each testimony layered nuance upon nuance, leaving no definitive portrait but a complex mosaic of culpability. The widow's public image fractured, her reputation reconfigured by the meticulous layering of evidence and contradiction. She remained composed physically, but internally, the awareness of exposure sharpened every thought. Outside the courtroom, media narratives evolved rapidly. Headlines alternated between sympathy, outrage, and curiosity. Social media amplified every gesture, every slip, every word. Public opinion swirled, but inside the law remained procedural, methodical, unswayed by spectacle. Justice unfolded through evidence, testimony, and legal argument, but emotionally it remained incomplete. The motives of the pair were impossible to separate cleanly. Manipulation intertwined with survival, desire overlapped with necessity. By the final day of testimony, a quiet tension settled over the room. Observers sensed the culmination of months of planning, crime, and concealment. The widow and her lover, once partners in secrecy, now faced one another in mutual vulnerability, each understanding the precariousness of their position. Every word exchanged, every glance, every recollection poised on the edge of revelation. In the courtroom mirror, both saw themselves reflected, not as fugitives, but as participants in a drama far larger than either had imagined. Justice had begun its procedural course, but the emotional reckoning was just emerging, ready to challenge them in ways neither could fully anticipate. The courtroom was silent as the judge cleared his throat, the weight of months pressing into every corner of the room. Convictions were read aloud, deliberate and precise. Premeditation, conspiracy, fraud. Each sentence landed like a hammer, final yet measured. Years were assigned with a cold arithmetic that ignored motive, desire, or justification. She listened without flinching, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed, almost serene. Inside, however, a different calculation was unfolding, one that no courtroom could measure. Her lover's sentence came first. The young man, still shaking from exposure, absorbed the verdict like a physical blow, the reality of years stretching ahead pressing down on him. He glanced at her briefly, eyes wide with recognition of complicity, guilt, and betrayal, but she did not respond. Silence held between them, unspoken acknowledgement of shared transgression, of a plan that had carried them through crime and escape, now rendered fragile by confession and evidence. Every glance was loaded with meaning, every hesitation catalogued by memory, storing knowledge that would not fade. Then her sentence. The reading was precise, yet the room seemed to hold its breath. Years assigned, fines imposed, and restitution mandated. She remained still, the mask of widow and survivor intact for all to see. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, observers whispered behind hands. But none of it reached the interior landscape where she calculated consequences that were emotional, psychological, and indelible. Guilt had never been her burden. It was control, desire, and the cost of wanting more than she had been given. She reflected quietly on the moments before the crash, the careful planning, the stolen freedom that had once felt limitless, time compressed strangely in those final moments. Attorneys gave brief instructions. Court officers directed movements. Cameras followed. Yet internally she was removed, floating across years of calculation and consequence, tracing the trajectory from dissatisfaction to escape, from escape to exposure. She remembered each step as if reviewing a blueprint, each choice as a line on a map that led inexorably to this room. Nothing in her mind was chaotic. Everything was deliberate, layered with intention and foresight, yet now irreversible outside. Spectators murmured, journalists summarized, and the public digested moral calculus in neat, digestible fragments. Her life had become case study, cautionary tale, and headline simultaneously. Yet the narrative they constructed in sound bites could not capture what lingered beneath the surface, the quiet, personal reckoning that would follow every waking hour. Freedom had always been conditional. Exposure, she realized, was permanent. There was no court that could return her to anonymity. No sentence that could erase the weight of seeing the truth reflected back in eyes that knew it too well. She glanced at her lover one last time. And in that moment, the years ahead became tangible. Years of reflection, of reckoning with choices, of living with the knowledge that desire carries consequences far beyond what is imagined in planning. She did not feel fear nor relief, only a deep, resonant awareness of cost, the price of wanting more than what was given, and the permanence of what had been revealed. Every secret, every calculation, every step toward escape had been laid bare. As the gavel struck, finality settled into the room, yet the emotional weight remained unresolved, suspended like smoke. Her mind traced forward, imagining life behind walls, imagining the persistence of consequence in every memory and interaction. Exposure, she realized, was more enduring than imprisonment, more penetrating than time, more inescapable than guilt. The truth, once unearthed, never fully disappears. Her eyes drifted upward toward the gallery, observing faces she would never see again, scanning the room for judgment that was now irrelevant. And for a heartbeat, she allowed herself a fleeting thought. What comes next, beyond the sentence, beyond observation, beyond the walls that promised containment but could not erase understanding? The question lingered, unanswerable, a whisper that promised the story was not yet over.